The protocol, operating under the conditional name Deferred Freedom, has already been activated. It was never formalized as law. It has no single office, no press service. It was never advertised as a trap. That is precisely why it operates without interruption. At the moment you are listening to this material, the system is already performing its primary function. It is cutting most people off from financial freedom long before they can understand what was actually taken from them. Formally, everything appears legal. Salaries are processed, loans are issued, banks publish reports, markets open every day, regulators release calm statements. But the full picture is missing, and that absence is the key sign of the problem. If you remove the noise of motivational advice, promotional courses, and generic phrases about success, one dry conclusion remains. Most people do not fail to reach financial freedom because of one major mistake.
They are embedded in a mechanism that systematically turns their income into fuel for someone else's stability. What follows is material that is usually dissolved in complex terminology, scattered reports, and safe wording. In simplified form, the scheme looks like this. A person works their entire life not only for themselves. A significant share of their energy serves a system in which access to assets, information, cheap money, and time has been distributed unevenly from the very beginning. The anomaly was not discovered overnight. It was assembled piece by piece. First came signals that did not look like a scandal. Central bank reports on household savings, investigative journalism on debt-driven consumption models, data showing that a large share of the population in developed countries cannot cover even a relatively modest unexpected expense without using credit, selling property, or falling behind on other payments. Then a second set of signals appeared. The value of assets, especially housing and financial instruments, began rising faster than the real income of a large share of workers. At the same time, the financial services sector expanded rapidly. It was not creating a new product. It was monetizing access to income that already existed. Fees, interest, penalties, subscriptions, deferred payments, convenient installment plans, limits, premium packages, microcredit, debt refinancing, paid educational programs promising quick wealth. All of it looked like separate markets. In reality, these were components of a single extraction loop. In 2008, the world had already seen what happens when the financial system detaches from people's real ability to pay. The mortgage crisis did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of a long accumulation of decisions in which short-term gain was treated as sufficient justification for long-term risk.
Later, when the Panama Papers were published, another part of the structure became visible. In the upper layers of the system, there are legal and semi-legal routes for hiding ownership, optimizing taxes, and shielding assets from public scrutiny. In the lower layers, a different logic applies. There, people are sold not protection for an asset, but a delay of the problem. And that is the key point. Wealthy capital buys time. The ordinary person, as a rule, rents time through debt. That difference is where structural injustice was identified. The chronology of observation remained consistent. First, the public was told that the main problem was a lack of financial literacy. Then, a second version was added. The problem was supposedly rooted in the psychology of consumption. After that came a third layer of explanation. Algorithms, digital services, and markets were supposed to democratize access to financial opportunity. In practice, the opposite happened.
The more digital the system became, the more accurately it learned to predict human behavior, weak points, fatigue cycles, impulse purchases, fear of status loss, preference for short decisions, and resistance to waiting. In effect, we arrived at a model in which the financial landscape does not simply respond to demand.
It designs demand through interface, design, credit access, and the everyday normalization of life in debt. To understand the scale of the deviation, it is necessary to define how the mechanism is supposed to work in a normal system. In the basic model, money performs at least three functions. It gives a person the ability to cover current needs. It allows part of value to be transferred into the future through savings. And it provides the possibility of expansion through investment in an asset, a business, or a skill that can generate a larger income stream later. In a healthy system, a person's labor is gradually transformed into capital. It works like a reservoir.
Part of the flow goes to current consumption. Part is accumulated. Part is directed into channels that increase the total volume of water over time. If the system functions properly, the reservoir is not emptied every morning. If the system is distorted, all the gates are set in such a way that the flow exits faster than it can accumulate. The person works, but the water level does not rise. That is the basic marker of the absence of financial freedom. Not low income in itself, but the inability to convert years of labor into growing ownership and control over time. Now to the anomalies. The first sign is that for most people, money does not have time to become an asset. It disappears at the stage of maintaining access to life. Housing, transport, basic safety, medicine, education, digital infrastructure, debt servicing. In a normal system, these expenses should still leave a sufficient remainder for accumulation. In a distorted system, they extract almost the entire resource. The consequence is obvious. A person gains experience over the years, but does not gain freedom. Their professional value grows. Their negotiating position in the labor market may even improve. But any disruption throws them back to zero or below zero. This does not look like a personal failure. It looks like a design in which resilience was never intended for the majority of participants. The second anomaly. Income growth is often accompanied not by accumulation, but by the expansion of financial obligations. In theory, higher income should accelerate the transition to independence. In practice, a different scenario takes over. As income rises, access to credit rises with it. Banks, financial services, the rental market, and the consumer sector immediately recalibrate to the new level of purchasing power. The person is offered not an asset, but an upgraded version of their lifestyle. A more expensive apartment, a car with a larger monthly payment, premium services. Psychologically, this is framed as a deserved improvement. Economically, it often functions as a mechanism for neutralizing income growth. As a result, the person has higher turnover, but not greater freedom. The system does not forbid them from becoming wealthy. It simply makes it far more profitable for itself when the person looks successful while remaining financially dependent. The third anomaly. Basic assets rise in price faster than most people can accumulate the means to buy them. This is not limited to elite instruments. It includes housing, land, shares in major companies, stakes in businesses, and in some cases, even access to educational pathways that were once treated as social elevators. In a normal system, a worker who acts responsibly and sets aside part of their income should have a realistic chance of catching up with the asset market. In a distorted system, they are running on a belt that is moving in the opposite direction. The longer they wait, the more expensive the entry becomes. The consequence is strategic. The person loses not only money, they lose a time window, and that is already irreversible. The fourth anomaly. The information environment deliberately shifts attention from structure to personal character. People are constantly told that the reason for their financial vulnerability lies in isolated habits. Coffee, taxi rides, impulse purchases, wrong thinking, insufficient motivation. Some of this does matter, but only some of it. This approach is useful to the system because it redirects the conversation away from the architecture of income, taxation, asset prices, monetary policy, and access to capital, and toward minor behavioral details. It is like explaining a chronically leaking ship by pointing to the crew's bad habit of storing buckets in the wrong place. The consequence is double. The person feels guilt. At the same time, they fail to see the real sources of resource loss.
The fifth anomaly. The financial sector often earns more from a person's instability than from their stability. In a normal model, banks, insurers, and investment services should be interested in the client being strong, solvent, and reliable over the long term. In practice, a significant part of profit is generated at the intersection of anxiety, urgency, and deficiency. Late fees, short-term loans, charges for fast access, penalties for exceeding limits, forced protection products, the sale of complex financial instruments to people who do not understand the real risk. These are not accidental distortions. They are profitable lines of business. The consequence is obvious. The smaller a person's financial cushion, the more expensive mere existence becomes inside the system. The sixth anomaly. The concept of freedom has been replaced by the concept of access. This point is especially important. People are no longer promised ownership. They are promised subscription, service, rent, credit limit, temporary usage. It looks modern and flexible, but there is a fundamental difference between the right to own and the right to temporarily use. Ownership works for a person even while they sleep. Access works only as long as payment continues. The consequence is that large groups of people are trained not to build capital, but to maintain their status through a continuous stream of payments. Any interruption in that stream means a sharp fall in quality of life. The seventh anomaly. The education market often sells not financial competence, but the illusion of a shortened route. This is an industry in itself. Quick trading courses, secret investment models, aggressive leverage strategies, promises of escaping poverty in a few simple steps. In a normal system, education should reduce risk. Here, it is often sold as a high-risk ticket to exceptionality. The consequence is predictable. Some people do not merely fail to move closer to freedom. They lose additional money, time, and trust in real tools of accumulation. The eighth anomaly. Time works asymmetrically. For capital, time is an ally. For most wage earners without assets, time is often an enemy. Inflation erodes savings, rent rises, the cost of entering the asset market increases. Strength, health, and willingness to take risk do not automatically improve with age. In a normal system, a person should feel that each year of labor strengthens their position. In a distorted system, many experience the opposite. The further it goes, the more expensive it becomes to catch up with what seemed reachable only a few years earlier. The ninth anomaly. Regulators, politicians, and major institutions mostly evaluate stability not by whether people are moving toward freedom, but by whether the payment system and debt servicing continue to function. These are different things. If people keep paying their loans, covering their bills, avoiding mass default, and preserving bank balance sheets, the system is considered stable. Even if, inside that stability, millions of people live without reserves, without assets, and without real control over their time. That is the most troubling signal of all. A system can be stable for itself and toxic for the participant at the same time. Now to the hypotheses. There is an innocent explanation. According to that version, what we are seeing is not a conspiracy, but the result of several old models colliding with a new reality. Monetary policy from previous decades, globalization, technological shifts, demographic pressure,
outdated education systems, slow wage adaptation, the complexity of political reform. In that version, no one intentionally built the trap. It emerged as a consequence of bureaucracy, inertia, and too many years spent living under rules designed for another era. In that interpretation, there is no single center of control. There is only a set of actors pursuing narrow interests without seeing the full effect. But there is also a second hypothesis. It is far harsher. According to this version, the system understood long ago that mass financial freedom for the majority is economically inconvenient. An independent person is harder to govern through fear. They are less likely to accept unfavorable working conditions. They have a greater ability to wait. They take expensive debt less often under pressure. They respond less to imposed status signals. They spend more time verifying information. If that is true, then what we are dealing with is not an accident, but architecture. In that model, people are allowed to dream of freedom while being kept in a state of chronic employment, credit vulnerability, and informational noise. Not totally, not for everyone, but for most. Where should the evidence be sought? First, in court records. That is where supposedly exceptional cases are often shown to repeat themselves with identical logic. Second, in central bank and international institutional reports on savings structure, debt, and asset ownership. Third, in blockchain records, especially in places where new financial schemes claimed transparency, but in practice, concealed concentrated control. Fourth, in the internal documents of banks, platforms, and marketing agencies, when those materials become available to journalists. That is usually where it becomes visible that clients are segmented not by what benefits them, but by the monetization potential of their weakness. Fifth, in ownership statistics. If economic growth is accompanied by increasing inequality and access to basic mechanisms of accumulation, that is not background noise. It is a signal. The geopolitical scale of the problem is much larger than is usually acknowledged. The Federal Reserve of the United States, the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, and national regulators all see fragments of it. They know about debt pressure. They know about overheated asset markets. They know about the gap between income and housing prices. They know about household vulnerability. But the response is almost always cautious. Why? The first reason is simple: fear of panic. If citizens were told plainly that a large part of the model of prosperity rests on debt, inflated valuations, and political delay in real reform, the consequences would not be merely economic. The second reason is bureaucracy. Large institutions are slow to recognize problems that do not fit established categories. The third reason is conflict of interest. Some of the measures that could improve access to freedom for the majority would hit entire sectors that have spent years profiting from the current structure. One more detail must be fixed in place. At the level of international politics, an unstable but manageable consumer often proves more convenient than an independent owner. Economies need demand. Banking systems need debt servicing. Asset markets need incoming money. Politicians need a calm horizon up to the next electoral cycle. Under these conditions, a strategy of deep redistribution of opportunity looks too slow and too expensive. That is why patchwork dominates. Some relief, some compensation, some access programs, some rhetoric about equal opportunity. But the core machine that extracts time and income remains intact. We are now approaching the main conclusion without the right to call it final. Most people will not experience financial freedom, not because they do not try hard enough, and not because freedom itself is a myth. The problem is different. They have been taught to confuse motion with progress, access with ownership, income with capital, status with independence, convenience with advantage. And most importantly, they have been taught to treat the lack of freedom as a personal defect rather than an object of systemic analysis. That is the most effective element of the entire structure. A person who blames only themselves is less likely to ask questions about the architecture of the game. There is no call for panic here, and there is no point in romanticizing an exit from the system. A complete exit is almost impossible. But something else is possible. To see that the real struggle is not only over the size of income, it is over the right to convert the time of one's life into an asset, rather than into endless servicing of access to a basic level of existence. That is the real front line. Not between poor and rich in the everyday sense, but between those who manage to convert their resource into ownership and those whose resource is constantly dissolved into someone else's balance sheet. One open question remains. If regulators, banks, governments, and international institutions have been watching the same signals for years, yet continue to describe them as isolated difficulties of adaptation, then what exactly are they protecting first? People? Or a structure in which the absence of financial freedom for the majority stopped being a malfunction long ago and became standard operating condition?